Hi everyone, good to see you guys. It's Ren here. Welcome to my room. I hope you've been doing well. I have not made a video in about 3 weeks at this point, so just checking on you. It's not an easy period at the moment to be in, so always good to look after each other. So in this video, I want to get a little bit deeper into this notion of function, cognitive function. You know, when I look back at all the videos that I have made over the last 3 years or so, I realized that when it comes to discussing the broad topics, what is a certain type like, what are the common traits among people of a certain type, or traits that they have in common with people of other types, and so on and so forth, and all these different themes relating to the INFJ personality, which in a sense is my domain of expertise, if you like. What I've realized is that I think that a lot of that ground I consider to have covered at this point. So I'm really interested these days in trying to identify particular issues, like lingering issues in the community, whereby I think that certain mistakes are made, certain confusions persist. I think that to a certain extent, I see some of these confusions being cleared in certain particular localized regions, but it doesn't seem to take place at the broader level. So I'm interested in sort of veering into that territory, because in a certain sense, when it comes to the more general topics, I just feel like my job has been done, and I need to kind of find new avenues for my motivation to remain vibrant, So that's kind of what I'm trying to do with this video and the videos to come. Now, I've talked a lot about the functions and the difficulty that they present for people who only have a superficial understanding of what they are. So I've made videos where I emphasize that, if you have a function stack, as you do have a function stack, each function is qualitatively different from each other, in the sense that a TI tertiary function in the case of an INFJ, for example, is not only different from the TI of an INTP, TI dominance, in the sense that it's mustered less often, but also it's different in nature. But and I have made videos as well about the content function fallacy and other such fallacies that are quite prevalent. And so I feel like I don't necessarily need to return to that. But what I wanted to focus on today is the notion of stack as a whole, and trying to really understand what a stack means and what it involves for a person of a certain type. Because I'm a little bit uncomfortable about the nature of the discussions that take place when people talk about the functions. One important issue with this is that oftentimes when people talk about their type, or people talk about types in general and break them down into functions, one of the mistakes they inevitably make is that they look at the individual functions in isolation from one another. And they tend to individualize the functions. In fact, they tend to personalize the functions. So they will talk about their FE as if their FE was like an individual person that was doing things next to NI and next to TI, and each was kind of doing their thing. And if you take the group together and you drop a little bit of SE in there, then you get an INFJ, right? And that's an issue for me, because functions by themselves don't have an ego. You could sort of look at the ego of the subject as a kind of prism through which all the functions are manifested, but they're not manifested like as ghosts in the machine, as a philosopher once said, in the sense that like they're not little tiny individualities within the broader individuality, and that when you do that kind of thing, you can end up getting mistaken, not just in your understanding of the functions, but in the understanding of the broader type of which the functions are manifestations. So the key is always to keep the unity in mind. okay? The unity is as far as whatever of the ego MBTI or the Jungian theory captures, the unity is in the function stack, okay? Function stack is 4 functions, not 8, okay? The shadow functions, the so-called shadow functions, are really only defined in terms of their relation to the main functions and don't manifest enough in daily life to actually be captured in sufficient fashion to be discussed. They can be intuited, they can be deducted, but they cannot be identified as such as individual manifestations. So what you have is the function stack, and that side of the ego is captured not by the disaggregated function stack, but by the unity of the function stack. And the question is, how do I capture and model this unity? The ego is a unity. Consciousness, in fact, is a unified field. This is what makes consciousness possible, and this is what makes my consciousness my consciousness. It's a unified field, no matter how complicated and how many things happen within it. The conscious field is a field, and it's unified by something at the center. We don't know if it's, if it's an I or if it's something else. Lots of people think it's an I or the formal subject or whatever you want to call it. But let's say that a part of it is captured by the unity of the function stack, right? And you have to, I really encourage you to keep in mind that the function stack is a unity. I want to emphasize this because this is the key to understanding the deep nature of the function stack. It's a unity. So whenever you talk about functions as if they were individuated from one another and an independent existence from one another, you can do this by means of metaphor if you want, but the risk that comes with that is that you end up losing sight of the fact that you're using a metaphor, and you could be interpreted by others, but maybe in the end also by yourself, as speaking literally, and that's what you want to avoid. So if the function stack is a unity, what does that mean for the functions that constitute that stack? It means that the functions are deeply imbricated with one another. So even if you take an ENTJ, for example, and I made a video recently about ENTJs, what this means is that there's no way out, basically. There's no way out of thinking about an ENTJ in terms of their manifestation of FI, just as much of as their manifestation of TE, NI, and SE in this particular instance, right? So it's not really possible to capture a particular ENTJ's personality without taking FI, and including it as part of the equation. You can't just say, well, this particular ENTJ, they have no FI, but they have the other functions and they manifest. It's not really possible. And in a sense, what this means is that, and this is something that might seem counterintuitive at first sight, but is actually quite logical, is that an ENTJ's life is as much influenced by FI as it is influenced by NI, SE, and TE. The difference between those functions is how conscious they are and how consciously they manifest. FI is just as influential, but it manifests more unconsciously. NI is more conscious, a bit more conscious than SE. TE is the most conscious, which is why this is what you see the most. It's because the more conscious a function is, the more conscious this particular way of apprehending the world is, the more it tends to manifest naturally in the life of a person. And because it manifests naturally in the life of that person, because that bringing to consciousness allows the particular person to sort of visualize what they are doing consciously, they're also able to work on it and improve it in ways that are more obvious than the more unconscious functions. So in the case of an ENTJ, it's quite clear, and it's just the same in the case of an INFJ's SE, by the way. It's quite clear that it's going to be difficult for an ENTJ to consciously work on their FI because their FI is manifested unconsciously. It's very present, it's always there. It's just unconscious, and it's so unconscious that, of course, even for outside observers, it can be difficult to point out. And it's difficult to point it out, not because it's not there, but because the evidence of it is not manifested in obvious signs of language, for example, or it's not manifested in obvious particular modes of behavior. It's there, but it's always kind of in the background. It's always a little bit shrouded. Of course, it manifests in certain cases because it's still part of the stack, and this is where you can identify it. But that manifestation is very rarely conscious. And in fact, the more unconscious a function in your stack is, the more difficult it is possible to sustain conscious manifestations of it for long periods of time, which is why often, like if you're an INFJ, for example, and you engage in an activity that is known to involve reliance, say, on TI, you will notice that this activity tends to tire you quickly. It's not because you're not able to use whatever is associated with a TI function. It tends to be because the bringing TI to the forefront of consciousness is not something that's natural for an INFJ. It's possible to do it, but because it's not natural, it's like if you have something that's slightly under the surface. You could say maybe it's not unconscious, it's subconscious. It still is difficult to bring something subconscious to the surface and have it function at a very conscious level for extended periods of time. That's the same for all the different functions at different degrees. But what you need to keep in mind is that does not mean that the function is not there, and it doesn't mean that its manifestation is not deeply influential in your personality. You could even go so far as to argue that the inferior function, in some respect, is the most influential on an individual's life. It is the most influential, at least this argument can be made, for two reasons. The first reason I've already explained, it's part of the unity of the function stack, so it's there, and it's in this respect just as influential as anything else that is part of that unity of the function stack. But because it is difficult to bring it to the forefront of consciousness, because it is difficult to concretely place it in front of one's eyes and ask oneself questions about it. How can I work better on this? How can I deal with it better? How can I code better? How can I master this better? As a result of this, the function itself is not tamed according to where you want to bring it and where you want to lead your life in accordance with it, or with it as a tool. So there's a certain kind of wildness that remains present when your function tends to be tertiary or inferior. There's less of an ability to mold it in the way that you want. So not only is it influential, but it remains influential according to its own logic. Whereas if you're an INFJ, for example, your NI, you can sort of personalize it quite a bit. And if you're an INFJ, you know that you're aware of your NI and you know where you want to lead it. If you're an INFP, you're highly aware of your FI, quite aware of your NE, and you know where you like to lead them. It becomes much more difficult with your TE if you're an INFP, much more difficult with your SC if you're an INFJ, much more difficult with your FI of an ENTJ. Doesn't mean they're less influential. They're perhaps more influential because they follow their own logic. Okay, so it's important to do as much as possible, to do all you can to get to a better understanding of those functions if you want to be a healthy individual and if you want to be truly in charge of your life. Now, that was my perspective. Let me know what you think in the comments. See you guys.